My neighbor had a go-kart, and I got to go for a ride in the thing at a go-kart track. And I fell in love with the speed, the forces working on you, and well, I was hooked. My parents wouldn't let me have a go-kart. When a factory fire burned up my neighbor's go-kart, he sold me the engine for $1. And the thing had been melted. It had bubbles in the aluminum, and it was really a pile of junk, but I took it to my grandmother's house because my parents would have killed me if they'd known I bought that thing. And my grandmother taught me how to use my late grandfather's files to straighten everything out, and she had taught me how to make gaskets out of paper sacks. And we had to buy a few parts for the engine, but we mounted it on the side of an apple crate, and it ran. It pissed the neighbors off royally. And it took me a while to finally buy a refugee from a rental track, go-kart, to put it on. But that was when the switch was thrown, and I realized that you know, by building, I could get away with not spending a lot of money if I did all the work myself. I lived to race. I won so many races, I finally started having the track pay me rather than giving me trophies. But I got better and better building engines, and when I finally could afford a more expensive engine, I added ports to that too, and well, there's just all sorts of tricks I came up with to stay ahead of everybody. And my engines ran so well that by the time I was in the 8th grade, the late King Hussein from Jordan used to come to Texas twice a year to buy go-kart engines from me. Now, my father had a Jaguar XK120, so I enjoyed riding in that. He was so busy, we had the CIA sitting at both ends of our street because the work Dad was doing was all top secret back in the day. And you know, this is the Cold War times. And I saved my money up, and I finally bought a lightweight go-kart, and I put my engine on the thing, and I went to a couple races, and I did real well with it. My father came to Fort Worth from San Diego, where he was employed by Consolidated Vultee Aircraft. During the war, when they won the project, the B-24 bomber, they decided they were going to build a factory here in Fort Worth, because they didn't want to be building the airplanes on the coast, so they figured in Texas it was going to be safe. My dad didn't really want to come here, but he and 4 other engineers were sent here to support the production line of the B-24. My dad started hiring engineers here in Fort Worth and put together the best engineering group. The day Yeager broke the sound barrier, my dad walked into the general manager's office and said, "I want to build a supersonic bomber." He was told, "Go back to what you're doing, there's no need for it." Dad started working on the airplane, the B-58, all on his own, and 3 years later, when the Air Force asked for proposals for a supersonic bomber, Dad had the airplane designed. We won the contract for the B-58, which was the world's first supersonic bomber. Dad used math, area rule concepts. The B-58 was just an incredible airplane. After the B-58, Dad designed the F-111. By this time, he was vice president, head of all engineering. The F-111 was the first swing wing fighter bomber, and it was also the first airplane that could cruise at Mach 1 at sea level or below sea level. It had the best record of any airplane in Vietnam, and I understand when they'd come back from a bombing run, if they knew where there were enemy troops, they'd fly over them on the deck, and the shock wave from the sonic boom would blow the eardrums out of all the troops on the ground. Dad always planned for me to be a little version of him, an aeronautical engineer. My love affair with four wheels, though, kind of killed that. In 1968, an oil man here in Fort Worth sponsored me to build a Pro Stock car. And so I built that Pro Stock Boss 429 Mustang. The hook was really set then. Bunky Knudsen, who was the president of Ford Motor Company, had taken a liking to my project down here. In fact, he even called me a couple times. It was like speaking to God on the telephone. After our first season of racing, the first summer of racing, I went back to school. And for 1970, Knudsen saw to it that we got $390,000 as a budget. And I kind of thought for a minute, said, this is never going to happen again in my lifetime. And so I'm leaving school to go racing. And I did. I also got disowned for doing that. My parents did everything they could to keep me from racing. I taught myself all about airflow, built my first flow bench myself back when no one else had one. I became just engrossed in airflow through cylinder heads and making power with engines. And you know, it's paid off over the years. I'd only been in business 3 years when Roger Penske discovered me. And you know, I became head of R&D for Roger Penske and gave him the fastest car in NASCAR. And then when Citibank decided they didn't want to run NASCAR anymore, I went to the IndyCar program. And of course, Rick Mears won his first Indy 500 with heads that I designed. 3 months after winning Indy in '79, I ended up in the hospital with stage 4B lymphomic cancer. The doctors told my family I wasn't going to make it, but they fucked up and didn't tell me. I lost all the feeling in my feet, half of it in my hands. I started noticing things around me in nature, and life was just a whole lot better. I'd never even noticed any of that before because I was working so hard racing. I made it through. Well, the Grand Sport was the first race car that just blew my mind. I've never been able to get it out of my mind. I get goosebumps when I think about the things when I was watching them racing. We could have bought one of the 5 original cars, I say we, my father and I, for $2,700 back in 1967. My dad wouldn't loan me the money. I never forgave him. Once again, I could never get it out of my head, and as I was getting older, I've had many health problems in my life, and by 2009, my dad was getting old and getting dementia, and I said, before I die or Dad dies, I'm gonna have one of these cars. Buying one of the original cars was just completely out of the question. So we just decided we'll build one. I got together with Gary at Mongoose Motorsports in Ohio. I looked at a couple other Grand Sport builders. I wasn't real happy with what they did, but we went up to Ohio and I really liked his operation. I liked the way he built cars, and I told him, I want you to build the lightest possible car for me. I want the lightest car that you've ever built. Set about, what are we going to do with it? I decided I'm going to put an LS engine in it. I had some experience building some LSs for some road racers, and the architecture of the engine was just so much better than an old big block or a small block. I wanted to have a car that was very much like the original cars, so no heater, no amenities at all. My stereo's the side pipes on my car. We built this combination of intake manifold with a HARP fuel injection setup. I spent days and days grinding on it to make it look like individual throttle bodies, make it look like it was built back in '63. And then I had special stacks built for it, so it once again has the look of a 1963 car. And these cars do move. They're damn near out of control anytime you get on them. But that's what I wanted. I wanted a car that, you know, was just, you had to work at driving. And any car that's not a challenge to drive is a car that I'm not interested in driving or owning. When I started Endyn, my intent was to learn more about airflow and engines than any of my competitors, and then I was going to build engines and go back racing pro stock and whip all their asses. Racing has always been my deal. Now, things got interrupted because customers started asking me to do heads using my flow bench, which nobody had ever seen at the time, and they were winning. Everybody was shocked that some kid here in Texas was out thinking Detroit. And I had every company in Detroit wanting my services. I had all the racers wanting my stuff. A vice president of Toyota came to me. They wanted to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And would I design a cylinder head for it? And I said, well, what engine does the cylinder head have to fit? And they told me, oh, you don't understand. We'll design the rest of the engine around your cylinder head. And I thought, my God, I've died and gone to heaven. And I spent a year and a half with 60 of their engineers working on that program. We made fantastic gains. We made gains that were so far beyond anything I ever imagined. I got to a point in '87 where my wrists were hurting, my elbows were hurting, just old age, basically. And then a Toyota engineer told me to buy a Honda Civic in 1989. And I did. And I started having fun with cars again because I was whipping up on guys with Corvettes. It was kind of like my old days with small block Ford beating buddies with big block Chevys. It's like you stab them in the heart and twist it, you know, especially with a four-banger and front-wheel drive. Fun came back in, and people started asking me for parts. And I bought my old flow bench back, started doing cylinder heads again. I can't tell you how many hundreds, if not thousands, of cylinder heads, Honda heads I've done. You know, my merger with Mast was something I felt like needed to take place. Horace had moved his entire cylinder head machining operation down to Nacogdoches from Michigan. And so all the machining's done there. It just makes sense if I become part of Horace's company and we do all the machining there in Nacogdoches. The real goal on this is I love racing. If you don't have parts to support racing, it goes away.